Indian soldiers were killed, it affects all our lives. You've got 2 nuclear states. It's not even the region. So I've said this at the end of one of my books, that you cannot say that this is a bilateral issue when the whole region is at stake and the peace of the world is threatened. So I just want us to think that this is a very serious issue. It's as old as Pakistan, because we have to acknowledge that the dispute began in 1947. It's been fluctuating. There have been cycles of violence. There have been cycles of relative peace. There have been some flashes of hope where we've seen that there might be a possible resolution. But the longer you wait, the more dangerous it becomes. And I think this is what we've just seen this recently. It is imperative that there is a resolution of the entire issue. So with that little minor introduction, I'm going to turn first of all to Ayesha and ask you, Ayesha, you know, you've written so much about the importance of history and historiography and understanding. Kashmir Scars, where are we now? Where are we going to go with the Kashmir issue?
I mean, we only have seen, I mean, I wrote Kashmir Scars in 1990. And, you know, so that's 30 years. And all we've seen is more blood flowing, both in the valley and in what we call, quote-unquote, Azad Kashmir. The blood continues to flow, people continue to suffer, militarization continues, the national narratives are framed in securitization imperatives, leaving very little room for a consideration of something that I think should be the #1 concern for all decent human beings, and that's humanity. Humanism, our basic humanity, which is daily violated in the valley and also in what is now Azad Kashmir. I mean, because of the militarized nature of the dispute. So what we have here are 2 states, on neither of which we have much control, the powers that be. We are just sort of panelists talking about an area that we care about. But what we do have are people who are very, very damaged. I think that psychologically, the statistics coming out of Kashmir show the psychological damage to Kashmiri people. And I just feel that as Pakistanis and even as citizens of the world, for political reasons, we take our gaze off Kashmir or pretend that everything's fine. And India and Pakistan really have treated this dispute as a real estate dispute. And we simply and must foreground the people. They come first. We must solve this problem. If we don't, we do, as Victoria has eloquently said, face the prospect of a nuclear war.
Well, I mean, I think it's
that's an exaggeration.
It's the worst case scenario.
But it can accidentally start off.
I think accidentally, but also I think, you know, for everybody living in the region, poverty eradication, health and education, the great military build-up, all of these things are because of this issue that it's batted about between Islamabad and Delhi like a sort of shuttlecock. Meanwhile, people are suffering, and I think it's very difficult to get statistics, but by conventional terms, using Indian sources, at least 70,000 people have been killed since the insurgency began in 1990. You know, it's an extraordinary number of people, and again, we get immune to the number of people. We also get immune to the trauma, and in a previous session I was sitting in, we were talking about the war in Syria and the psychological stress, the trauma of people living as they have been for 30 years now, with militarization. And again, however many military soldiers are there is almost irrelevant. There are an enormous number of soldiers in the Valley of Kashmir. And I think this is something that it's intolerable for the people living there. Now, with this latest incident, their lives are put on hold. Our lives aren't necessarily put on hold. We're one step removed. You've got India with its rhetoric against Pakistan, but it's still not as it is for those people living in the valley. And your focus has been, of course, on the region of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. Again, there is still, you know, a situation there which we're not entirely truthful about, because it's a little bit like in the Valley of Kashmir, there's a particular rhetoric, a particular narrative which comes out. And so perhaps you might like to just give us the focus of your book and your research.
Sure. I'm going to go back to what you started off with, the monolithic kind of identity we tend to impose as hegemonic nations onto Jammu and Kashmir. When we imagine the Kashmir conflict in Pakistan, but I think as a world as well, we tend to see it confined to the other side of the LOC, to the valley. And that's rightly so because of the sheer degree of violence over there. But Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh and Gilgit-Baltistan and what is called Azad Jammu and Kashmir over here are also linked very much geographically, territorially, strategically, politically, economically to the conflict. So is it possible that the other regions do not face the repercussions? Right? That's the first question. The second question then is, what does it even mean to be Kashmiri? Because traditionally, Kashmiri identity has been linked with the language. And so, the common rhetoric you will often hear is that AJK is not even Kashmir because the people over there speak Pahari or Potahari. But when you look at the Kashmir conflict as a political conflict, you very quickly realize that the Kashmiri identity is also a political identity. So regardless of the language that you speak or regardless of the region that you're in, you are linked to the conflict. Now, when we foreground, with that understanding, and then when you go into AJK, you realize that it is very much part of the conflict and it very much suffers the conflict. It is not
both intellectually, ideologically, and physically, and due to the shelling.
Absolutely. So, I want to just maybe focus on two main areas of the violence and the suffering that I saw. Firstly, I think it's really important to remember that there are many thousands of refugees from across the LOC, from the valley, who have, who came in to AJK and have been living over here. So you actually have people who've gone through the brutality and the torture. They came over and, it's going to be close to 30 years, and they're still divided from their families. And they live in refugee camps without proper sanitation, without proper sewage lines, without proper heating, without any facilities. So the Kashmir conflict is living, it's alive over here. But then you also have people living on the line of control. And more so you have women. So there's also gender dimension to conflict because men have often moved to the cities for work. So it's the women and the children left behind to take care of livelihood, livestock, land, and so forth. And so I've spoken to people, women and children who have literally lived for a decade in bunkers, in and out of bunkers. I've spoken to women who've had to cut their own, flesh to feed their children blood so they don't get dehydrated. There are harrowing stories on this side of the line of control, and when we read the news, we come across these statistics, so many people die, ceasefire violations on this part or that part of Kashmir. But what does that really mean for the people living over there? What does that mean for a generation that could not go to school? What does that mean, when you lose your livestock and your entire source of livelihood? So the conflict has so many shades, and it manifests in the violence, but it also manifests in terms of political and economic concerns and questions about the future. Because if these regions are linked to the Kashmir conflict, right, then that means that Gilgit or AJK, regardless of their political affiliation or association, cannot be provinces. If they cannot be provinces, then they cannot benefit from development as the other provinces do. So what does the future hold, whether or not they affiliate or associate with the Kashmir conflict? It has repercussions for them.
Yes, I agree. I think we need, this is where this composite picture has to be held up. Because without looking at the composite picture, you're not going to get resolution. And you point to the situation with Gilgit-Baltistan. I remember when I was there doing some interviews in the 1990s, and I met a gentleman who said he was 57, and he said, I was 7 when I wanted to become part of Pakistan. I'm 57 now, and I'm still wanting to become. Of course, now Gilgit-Baltistan is called Gilgit-Baltistan, and it's no longer the northern areas. But I think this is something also in terms of history, and we're a little bit lazy, and we journalists can be lazy too. I was reading an article in The Guardian following this recent attack in Pulwama, and the report said they were talking about Jammu as the region next door to Kashmir, as though Kashmir was the region where the problem was, and Jammu was not part of the the state. So again, I mean, it goes back to your point, which we heard so eloquently in the previous session, Ayesha. There's no free lunch. There's no free.
No, well, you've got to do work if you're reporting
to understand the issue.
But that's why I think I really would like to say a word or two about Anam's book, which I read very, very diligently when she asked me to write a blurb. I mean, I think I really highly recommend it to all of you. We typically think of the Kashmir conflict as confined to Srinagar or the valley. And I must say that I do have some disagreements with her because I do go to the valley and I do think there's some differences. And I don't mean to say this very lightly, but I do think that, you know, in the valley, you are stopped and searched at any instant because of suspicion of your religion. Interestingly enough, that's not the reason why people are being oppressed in Azad Kashmir for this conflict. And I think beyond that, there is no difference. So, I mean, I think that in terms of the oppression that the people of the valley feel, it's just something that you have to understand. You have to go and see it. And I think that what has happened to Pakistan, at least in the last few years, when an escalation of violence in this country led Pakistanis, I think, to be more inward-looking, move their gaze away from Kashmir. I remember the days when every newscast would begin with Maqbooza Kashmir. I think over the years, the terror bombings in this country have taken over, and many other issues have taken over. And so my last visit to Kashmir, one of my last visits to Kashmir, the Kashmiris complained that Pakistanis hame bhul gaye hain. So I said, no, they have forgotten us. And I said, that's not true. They just have a lot of problems of their own. But one thing that has happened, which I'd like to convey to you all, is that there are gross human rights violations that are beginning to irritate and annoy a lot of my Indian friends as well, and their compatriots, but Pakistanis who are angry because for 70 years they've been fed the Kashmir discourse, and they feel, rightly or wrongly, that this has been partly responsible for the denial of democratic rights because of the way the country evolved. They have adopted the attitude of complete apathy to what is happening today in the valley. And I am absolutely flabbergasted.
Yes, that's sort of the reverse side of the concern.
It's a reaction to a national narrative that has gone nowhere with the main symbol.
You see, I think
would you agree, Anam, or do you, this narrative that people have become apathetic even to what's happening in the valley, far less in Azad Kashmir, which they don't even know about?
Well, you know, when I started researching for the book, that was in 2014, and really Kashmir was not on the map in terms of what kind of coverage it was getting, and people were not thinking about it. I do think 2016 has changed things. After Burhan Wani's killing, and then the Uri attack, and then the surgical strikes, whether or not they happened, the whole discourse.
The use of pellet guns, I think, has wakened people up as well.
So all of that, 2016 has been a game changer. So now you see a little bit more interest, and you know what's happening right now in India with Kashmiris, what happened with Pulwama. I mean, all of that is, again, it's become politically relevant. Kashmir is now, again, politically relevant, but I think the apathy towards the Kashmiris is absolutely.
But the other problem, I mean, in terms of when you asked me the question, where are we at, that's the Pakistani at. But the Indian at is very interesting too, because in India, as the Congress party has withered and given room over the decades recent decades to the BJP, we're in a scenario.
Why doesn't the Indian state treat Kashmiri Muslims the way that Bihari Muslims or Keralite Muslims are treated? Why this huge difference? Because
Kashmir is the only part of Kashmir, or India, that is disputed by Pakistan. In other words, Pakistan has no claim to Kerala. Pakistan has no claim to Bihari Muslims. If anything, they're stranded in Bengal and Bangladesh, and we won't bring them, some of them. So I think that the reason why Kashmir is a exceptional case in India's, from India's point of view, is of Pakistan's claims to it.
Yes, I mean, I think to carry on with the answer with that, it does stem from 1947, and I think it was Tavleen Singh who wrote in her book Tragedy of Errors, Kashmir will always be special, Kashmir will always be suspect, and it is the tragedy of this unresolved issue at the time, that where should where should the state, again, going back to the full state, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, whether it should belong to Pakistan, whether it should belong to India. And that is the dilemma which you have now. Have you got,
Hi,
who's got the, sorry, who's got the mic?
Sorry, hi. I have a question for Ms. Ayesha Jalal. So, the different versions of how Mr. Vajpayee and Musharraf were close to coming up to...
I'm sorry, I missed you. I can't hear you.
Yes,
Sorry,
could
can
you
you hear
just
me now?
speak into the mic?
I think you should need to speak into the mic.
Okay, I'll
Yes.
speak into the mic now. Okay, so the different versions of how Mr. Vajpayee and Musharraf were close to finding a solution to the Kashmir issue during the Agra summit. So my question is for Ms. Ayesha Jalal, that what's her interpretation of that?
You know, I've heard a great deal about how if we hadn't lost Musharraf, i.e. if he hadn't been brought down by the political forces, that Kashmir would have been solved. You know, I'm a great skeptic when it comes to such claims, because if that had indeed been the case, surely we would have had some signs of what's coming. And my further investigation, and of course I've investigated that claim, suggests that if there was an idea, it was simply soft borders. And I would refer you to Manmohan's famous statement that we can't change borders, but we can make them irrelevant. So they were thinking along those lines, and then came the earthquake, and then, of course, eventually the sheer apathy of Manmohan's second term, where there was the scams, which completely sort of, you know, killed the government, and then the loss of and so that has changed matters quite considerably. So I'm actually of the view that at most, if there was a quote-unquote great brainwave that Musharraf had, it was nothing more than soft borders.
Yes, I don't think
yes,
there's anything new. Yes.
My question.
Wait a minute. Yes, where are you? Oh, good.
Hello.
Okay, yes, hello. Okay.
Hello, my question to Ayesha is that don't you think that Kashmir question is the continuation of the communal division of India, and it serves into the analogy of two-nation theory and Nazariya Pakistan, and on the other hand, Hindutva communalism, just not the political economy of conflict. And both the states are not ready to think beyond the prism of India-Pakistan conflict. And they use Kashmir issue to serve their purpose of militarization and undemocratization. We in Pakistan are very much concerned about the rights and right to self-determination of Kashmiris. But when we talk about the repression of Baloch, we just keep quiet. And our passion for right to self-determination is exhausted or compromised when it comes to Pashtuns or Siddhis or Baloch.
Your question?
There is no question, but I agree with you. Thank you very much. Next question.
Okay, next question. Okay, gentleman here.
You have done a great agreement.
I'm sorry?
I agree with you. I don't think there is any disagreement. It's a question of interpretation.
My
I mean, you
question
want
is
to see the solution through the communal... yes, that's one point. It does not actually exclude my argument. They're both mutually, you know, they're compatible. But I have no disagreement with you in terms of what serves India and Pakistan's purpose in letting Kashmir burn to death.
well.
Your question? Yes.
My question is to Dr. Jalal.
Very well.
I can't see anybody. I don't know where
Yes,
you
no,
are.
he's here. He's just there.
You can hear my voice. Well, do you think that the lingering of this Kashmir issue makes a case against the concept of the nation states?
Sorry, what's your...
Sorry, yes, can we hear that
I
again?
couldn't hear.
Do you think that the lingering of this Kashmir issue makes a case against the concept of the nation states?
The lingering of the makes...
No, I mean it doesn't, because what is the nation state but a hyphenated nation? So the point is that you know the Kashmir got squared up with India, the nation state of India, and so it's part of the nation state's efforts to sort of sort itself out. But I think Kashmir, as Victoria has eloquently not only said in the panel, but written brilliantly in her book on Kashmir, which I recommend to all of you as must read, shows that it is connected to decolonization. It is a question of decolonization, and we could, I mean, if there was political will, the Kashmir problem is solvable, in my view, relatively easier than the Arab-Israeli problem. But the tragedy is that the two nations of India and Pakistan they do not see the interest in solving the problem, which is the same issue. You want to call it communal, I'm calling it the political economy of war or conflict, which serves interests, that's all.
Yes, and I think the moments of potential solution are so, it's a glimpse. You feel you're almost there, but then somehow people tend to pull back. Because it's easier for the status quo. I mean, one of the traditional things is the status quo is not working, but everybody is too frightened to have anything other than the status quo. So they say one thing, but actually mean another. And this is certainly what I found with the Kashmiris. You somehow, again, as Ayesha says, the political economy of war is more beneficial. And to look into the crystal ball and think, well, actually, we want to have peace, people pull back. And what I will say is that one has to retain one's hope and also retain an awareness of the issue, because there might just be that chink of opportunity. And so if one's asleep or got one's back turned, then again it will be lost. There's a question here, this lady. Yes. Nice to have a lady. Can you stand? Who are you? Stand up. Yeah. No, yes, this lady. Oh, we're having him first. Okay. Right, first, and then you.
Thank you. There seems to be a distinct sort of a lack of international, or more specifically, Western attention on Kashmir. I don't mean to draw parallels or compare sufferings, but CNN and BBC will spend all day covering violence in Palestine, but that is not the case for Kashmir. Is it merely because India is quickly becoming an ally of the US in containing China? But that's not a good enough explanation, because Israel is also an ally of the US. So why the lack of, a relative lack of international attention on Kashmir? If I may use the term, the so-called human rights lobby in the West seems to be a bit silent on Kashmir as compared with other issues.
Well, I think if you talk to the... It's a good question, but if you talk to the Palestinians, they don't feel they've had nearly enough attention either. I think in terms of the international, also I will say this with the international community and civil society, they have done an enormous amount on human rights. And, you know, if you look at Amnesty International reports, you look at the European Parliament, but they get stuck on moving beyond condemning human rights. And India, as we know, has become not less powerful, but more powerful. And I'm afraid to say, again, going back to the political economy, it's not just a war between India and Pakistan, it's political economy in general. You look at the way the United States goes, you look at the way the United Kingdom goes to India, they're looking for trade deals. Do they mention the word Kashmir? No, they don't. The last time a British official mentioned Kashmir was in 1997, when the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook was here for the 50th anniversary celebrations, and he made a very sort of mild comment in Islamabad, and got them, the Queen then, who was on the trip, obviously got the most frosty reception from India. And it was at the time when I.K. Gujral said that Britain had no right to talk about Kashmir. It was a third-rate power on a par with Ireland. So, as I say, if the country doesn't want facilitation, mediation, it's very difficult. I mean, I've had people say, well, Britain ought to go to war with India. But it's not as simple as that.
I add one more thing for your purposes, which I think will just, I'd like to give you a little history of the Kashmir conflict in the international community. The international community expended a huge amount of energy from between 47 and the early 50s to try and sort out Kashmir. You know, Victoria's hit it on the head by saying that you can't, the UN cannot mediate if one party is not willing to accept mediation. India did not want to, I mean, the whole thing fell apart in terms of UN efforts to mediate between India and Pakistan on Kashmir, on the issue of whether or not there would be a plebiscite organization, and whether India would be allowed to keep its control whilst the plebiscite was taking place, or whether the plebiscite would be held under the UN. They could not agree. India kept saying Pakistan has to withdraw. Pakistan kept saying plebiscite has to be held under the UN. So nothing happened. So, and then the world lost interest by 54, because what was going on at the same time was India's efforts to just make Kashmir come, they started off with a special status, and throughout, from 47 to the early 50s, they put a stranglehold, they diluted Kashmir's special status. So when the world saw that, they saw no purpose in mediating. So you've got to understand the context of this. It's not that the international community has always ignored it. It's just that now it looks like that they are not interested. And I think that's the big question. Is it because of India's success? Is it because people don't want to talk about movements? Or is it simply because of Pakistan's behavior and people not wanting to, countries not wanting to support Pakistan? And I do think that the narrative of the Muslim terrorist and terrorism, I've heard on many occasions that Kashmir is the future bedrock of Muslim terrorism. I've obviously argued that it's more likely to be one if you don't solve the problem. But that issue yes. Continues.
Yes. No, and I think, I agree with Ayesha. I think it's not some great conspiracy theory, but you come up against a brick wall. And, if you're looking at it as a sort of an academic study, you would say, well, it would be much better to have a mediator, much better to have a facilitator, because then you can blame the facilitator for any compromise you may or may not have had to make, especially with a domestic community that would say sell out and, lost our principles. So one would say that it would be more sensible. But I go back to the original point, was that India is actually occupying the region that it wants to retain. And there the matter has stuck. Now we have this young lady here.
So
yes.
I wanted to ask, do you think that Kashmiris have some power, the indigenous agency to form a resistance?
Sorry, do they have, the Kashmiris have some power?
The indigenous agency to form a resistance of their own.
The Kashmiris have been resisting. They are resisting right now. They have agency. It's a very difficult scenario, but they've been resisting. But what's interesting is that unlike the 90s, when certain political groupings were calling the shots, now it's the youth. Beginning in 2008, it was the youth who took over. And they really have sort of been, the leaders are following the young people. I think that is a very interesting change. We don't know where it will go. But I'm not sure. I think the resistance is not going to end. If anything, there are signs of enhanced desire to resist amongst the youth of Kashmir. So I think in Pakistan, I think there has to be some acknowledgement that this problem is not going to go anywhere. And as Victoria has already said, at every time this escalates, you are going to be in the midst of it. So how are you going to react?
And it's worse. I think just in terms of a little bit of history, the 1990s, when, as Anam said, this idea of taking up the gun started, all the political parties had a militant wing. And it very much stemmed, and we have to put it in the regional context, from the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, which entered the vocabulary. I remember I was working at the BBC at the time, and we had a big issue as should it be in italics, should it be in inverted commas, what is this word that's entered our vocabulary? Mujahideen, freedom fighters. And that existed and very much inspired these Kashmiris who called themselves freedom fighters. But of course, then you had 9/11. And the boundary between freedom fighting and notwithstanding, people were reminding everyone that George Washington took up arms against the British and he was a freedom fighter. Yes, I'm sure you've heard of that one. Somehow the line was, there was no difference. A terrorist was a freedom fighter, and it became very difficult. And they also felt they weren't getting anywhere. There were losses, and that's when you got back into the political cycle. But now, as Ayesha says, there's a whole new generation, and they're taking up the gun. It's less formulated than it was because you don't quite have these political parties with their militant wings.
I'll just say one thing in addition to the resistance issue, which you very well put. I think that it's not just resistance with the gun. My own students who've come to Tufts, studied, Kashmiri students, and gone back, they're not taking up the gun. They're certainly taking up the pen, and some are taking to rap. So I think that what's most fascinating about Kashmir is the youth and the way in which they are resisting. And that actually, in my humble opinion, is what's unnerving the Indian security forces more than anything else, which is why they have been resorting to disproportionate violence against the Kashmiris. These pelters, stone pelters, they're just throwing stones, are being you just see their faces pockmarked with the pellets that they are sort of firing out. So it's a disproportionate use because they're rattled by the sheer ferocity of the resistance of the Kashmiris.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm just going to add to that. I mean, absolutely. It's the people who pick up guns that get the most, you know, I mean, they're highlighted. But like I was talking with the women, you know, in the protest, that's a form of resistance. Picking up the form is a part of resistance. Music, all of these things. So there are different forms of resistance, one of which is to go back to picking up the arms, which is, of course, very, very frightening, you know, for both nations, but for Kashmiris more than anything else. It's Kashmiris' lives on the line.
And I think actually one of the tragedies that I've seen is that the picking up of the gun and the youth, they know they're not going to be able to take on the Indian army, but it's been this just cause. We have a just cause. The international community will see our just cause, see that we're being killed and interfere. And this was a narrative that played very much in the 1990s.
This is somebody who had picked up arms. That's what he said. You know, he said, I never really wanted to, and I never really agreed with it, so I left it very quickly. But I will say that, you know, picking up arms put Kashmir on the map. No one really cared about Kashmir before.
I'd like to add to that. Yasin Malik is someone I think all of you know about. And when Yasin came to Tufts to speak at the Fletcher School after 9/11, I asked him, you've given up the gun. Are you advocating giving up the gun to the Kashmiris? And he said, no. Never give up the gun, because if we give up the gun, India won't take us seriously. Look what they've done to the Mizos. You can't give up the gun. I've given up the gun. I've become a Gandhian, but because they tortured him, and you know he's made his own decisions. But the fact is that he doesn't advocate giving up the gun. That's the interesting point.
No, it's very impressive. This gentleman here. Oh, 5 minutes left. Right, we've got you, and then we've got you. Where's the mic? Oh, we've here. Okay, so what have you? We've got at least 3 questions. Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is more towards Anam right now. It's about, you've talked about all these harrowing stories of the women who were living there. Don't you think that these stories have a bigger impact on everyone's perception of the situation over here? Then why is it that Pakistan does not take up these stories? Why does it not use these maybe as propaganda or whatever you may choose to call it to actually further their issue in this, their stance on this? Why is there such a silence on Kashmir from the media in itself here?
I don't think there's a silence. I think you get a lot of statistics coming in. What I think happens with ceasefire violations is both sides only report on the violations on their side. So you will never hear of anybody being killed in Pakistani firing, you know, on the Indian side. And similarly in India, they also have a reporting on ceasefire violations, but it's only about how many people died from Pakistani firing. So it's selective. And it does help beef up narratives on both sides. But I think this is not a Kashmir problem. This is a war reporting problem where we get stuck with statistics rather than, you know, looking at, you know, the people that Dr. Jalal was talking about. They need to be at the fore. They're often not. And I think this applies to most wars and conflicts, especially protracted ones that have gone on for so long.
Yes. Well, yes, but you haven't got the mic yet. So we've got the mic here. We've got to have the mic first. Yes, this lady here.
Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is really, it's about the kind of theme of hopelessness through the entire discussion today. So looking at the different rhetoric, the different kind of regions, the failed attempts, my real question is that do you have a vision of factors that might play a significant influence in the future of Kashmir? And I know that Anam mentioned CPEC, along with this Neelam Valley story, which seems like a small success. But in even the questions coming from the audience, there is this repeated theme of what to do now, what about the resistance, what about the untold stories. So I'm wondering how you kind of see the future of Kashmir.
It's a very good question.
Well, I think one of the first things that I can say to you about hopelessness and the hope that there is, but that also requires political will. So my political will issue was my point, that this is, I mean, I am not hopeless about Kashmir when I look at the actual realities of the conflict. I just said to you that it's an easier conflict to solve than Arab-Israel. largely because I've studied the issue, and I think it's India and Pakistan's real estate dispute over Kashmir. So one way to change that is to basically to make India and Pakistan understand that they are utilizing a concept of space. You know, the ideas of space historically have changed through history. And the idea of space that India and Pakistan have stuck on is an idea that the colonial state conceived of for its own purposes. And so that was the idea of monolithic absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty is a human construct. The very nations who talk about absolute non-negotiable sovereignty, the way India talks or Pakistan talks, have moved on, with all their problems in Europe, towards a sovereign entity to see how that might solve their problems. In other words, sovereignty and space are human conceptions. So when you are ready to change that conception, and one of the things I did, which is why this is called Kashmir Scars, I wrote a piece in 1990 which tried to come up with a solution where nothing really would change other than conceptions of space by India and Pakistan, and then suitable changes in their constitutions. So the point is that it can be solved. I'm actually not hopeless. The hopelessness for me stems from the sufferings of the people of Kashmir, not because I think that Kashmir cannot be solved.
And as we know, when you have a hopeless situation, they're very resilient.
My question to the panelists is, do you think the change of government in India can be a step towards resolution of Kashmir? Because Pakistan is forthcoming in holding dialogue with India.
Look, there was a Congress government for decades, and there was no solution. And then came along good old Vajpayee, and there was some hope. And then came along Narendra Modi, and there is no hope. So, I am not about to wager. I do not see a breakthrough possible, which is where my hopelessness for their suffering increases, not because I think that this is just a hopeless case.
And unfortunately, the latest Pulwama attack has not helped. Anam, I think you must also ask this word. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yes. No, I'm really sorry. Then we're going to ask it later because I'm going to thank Dr. Ayesha Jalal and Anam Zakaria very much indeed for coming.